My name is Debra Martin. I'm from the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and I'm actually presenting a summary today of a lot of research that's been ongoing on the human remains from a tomb in Tell Abraq. Okay. The site of Tell Abraq is in the UAE near the Persian Gulf on the border between Sharjah and Gawain, and was excavated in 1989 through 1998. Here's an early step trench view and a later photo revealing the 3rd through 1st millennium occupations. The aerial view was taken at the completion of the 1998 field season. Dan Potts was the principal investigator, and he has published extensively on the archaeology and the artifacts from the tomb. In 1989, Potts found indications of a 3rd millennium tower and a large fortification. Subsequent excavations revealed that settlement remains from the 2nd millennium and the 1st millennium were built around and on top of the older fortress, which also had an associated tomb. The tomb was buried under 2 meters of stratified deposit covered over by the growing settlement of the 2nd millennium. The tomb was located 10 meters to the west of the fortification tower, and both were built on the same original ground level. While fortresses and towers persisted into historic times, the use of collective tombs ceased to be the normative pattern at the end of the Umanar period around 2000 BC. The tomb was 6 meters wide and 2 meters high. Large rocks were used for the flat roof, and a single internal dividing wall supported a flat roof. Construction with beach rock and limestone ashlars is typical of Umanar style. The internal dividing wall extended to the back but stopped short in front of the tomb entrance, leaving a passageway. The tomb was used for about 100 years. The northwest corner was destroyed in ancient times and represents about a quarter loss of materials from the western chamber only. Overall, the tomb does not appear to have ever been looted. The interior of the tomb contains a deposit 1.4 meters thick of human bone, sand, and artifacts. The tomb is similar in construction to other Umanar tombs. This close-up of the south face of the tomb shows the finely masonized trapezoidal removable stone in the center. It is situated in front of the passageway linking the eastern and western chambers. The trapezoidal portal was the only entrance through which bodies could be deposited. In the western chamber, there were no articulated skeletons, only disarticulated and fragmentary bone. We hypothesized early on that this chamber was used first, as the bone bed was denser and the bones were commingled, fragmentary, and very dispersed. Now, in the eastern chamber, it was similar to the western, except for the finding of partially articulated body parts, such as some spines, feet, legs. These are individuals who were placed in the tomb probably towards the end of its use, possibly after the western chamber became full. The MNI for the tomb is over 400 individuals. The total volume of the tomb is around 28 square meters. Hypothetically, 400 living individuals standing side by side take up about 100 square meters of space. The tomb could have then held only 113 living people standing side by side. The only way to accommodate 400 burials would be to continually move the skeletonized remains into piles to maximize space for additional burials. Manually moving bones to consolidate them would result in them taking up less space, especially as larger bones broke, cranial bones flattened, and smaller bones crushed. With the western chamber being used earliest, we see no articulations, and the eastern chamber used later, we do see some partial articulations. By the end of the 100-year use, minimally 403 bodies, we could have predicted this amount of concentrated and commingled bone. However, as it turns out, this skeleton is the only fully articulated burial with associated grave goods in place. The location behind the entrance and in the passageway suggests that it may have been one of the last bodies placed in the tomb near the time of its disuse. We'll return to this body in a minute. Boz and Hager provide a useful classification for burials at Çatalhöyük. The earlier western chamber is clearly primary disturbed loose, with scattered and disarticulated human bone. The later eastern chamber is best described as primary disturbed, with some partially articulated skeletons found in their primary location, but disturbed from subsequent interment, and only one fully articulated individual near the doorway and the passageway between the east and the west chambers. Reconstructing the 3D location within the tomb is being done. by two UNLV graduate students. Using the ArcGIS program, they have entered 10,000 of the over 27,000 elements for which we have good provenience. Very quickly, here are some 2D captures for various bones. And then you just go through a couple of these and you'll see that bones are pretty well distributed between the eastern and the western areas, and that all elements are represented in both sides of the tomb. All bone elements are found then in all strata, in both chambers, and near the walls and near the center of the tomb. These data suggest that there were no formal rules about where particular bodies or body parts were placed or moved. The distribution of all elements of the skeleton suggests expedient placement of bones into the tomb as individuals died. Moving skeletons around as more individuals were interred caused the disarticulation and breakage. While this arrangement of the 400 plus individuals in the tomb suggests local community use, Leslie Gregorka did a study sampling a small number of the Tell Abraq remains, the purple dots on the slide, for isotopes, showing that they cluster with many other Umanar samples. However, there are two individuals who clearly came from elsewhere. We hope to pursue this heterogeneity of the tomb further with other biomarkers. For grave goods, dozens of complete pots, metal weapons, and stone vessels, along with hundreds of beads, were located throughout the tomb. 12 ivory combs, along with several gold pendants and an ivory stamp seal, all bear witness to Tell Abraq's far-flung contract and trade with Mesopotamia, Iran, Bahrain, Bactria, Baluchistan, and the Indus Valley. There are more ivory combs and hairpins at Tell Abraq than at any other site in Arabia. The floral patterns point to Bactria connections, but the source of the ivory is from India, Indian elephant tusk. Working with the adult fragments, Anna Osterholz devised a method using modifications of Nussel et al.'s zonal method for recording fragmentary remains. Anna designed a system in the Access database on key features of every major bone so that we could determine not only the minimum number of individuals in the tomb, but also which elements of bone were preserved and which were not preserved and missing. This diagram shows the MNI for a number of features, with the right in blue and the left in green, for the shoulder joint complex, the elbow complex, and the hand. These visuals help you appreciate the diversity and preservational qualities among the different areas of bones. Taking the ilium as an example, the MNI for the iliac blade is a maximum of 67, while the ischial tuberosity is 104. Dense bone preserved, porous bone did not. Dense bone survived being moved around, stepped on, piled upon, where less porous bone did not. Cranial bones are highly underrepresented, and we think that because of its fragile nature, it constantly got reduced to nothing but very small fragments. Dense round bones preserved quite well, as cervical vertebrae 1 and 2, and foot bones. For example, the MNI for the adults of the tomb stands at 276 based on the right talus. This chart shows the right-left concordance for a number of bones. This slide shows age at death for adults, as we could surmise from the pubic symphysis. There were 48 pubic symphyses, demonstrating largely young and middle-aged adult, with more males than females. Sexing the pelvis, the patella, the calcaneus, and the talus demonstrated a consistent trend towards more adult males than females in the tomb. For subadults, MNI is 127 based on the right femur. There are 28 infants, representing 22% of the subadults and 7% of the total population of the tomb. This is followed by 12 newborns, 46 infants, and 32 toddlers. Premature infants and newborn health is compared with other reports of nonspecific infection. The black bars represent preterm and newborns with active infection at the time of death. Older children do not seem as vulnerable to infections. This may indicate sick mothers giving birth to sick babies. Cranial depression fractures for adults show healed signs of trauma and may indicate some interpersonal violence that affected males and females alike. The composite represents all cases, but because crania are so underrepresented in the tomb, it's difficult to say how frequent trauma was at the population level. Analysis of 484 left and right patellas show high frequencies of both arthritic changes as well as osteochondral fractures. Males had more of these fractures, and they often came from putting stress on knees. Several other ongoing studies of adult infectious diseases underway, and early indications are that they are moderate to severe in expression and severity. An analysis of the most extreme forms of pathology on the adult population within the tomb showed some quite severe fractures and malunion, osteomyelitis, which is a severe form of infection, stress fractures on the foot, and knee and hip dislocations. Many of these were healed or healing, suggesting a system of health care for those who have these kinds of debilitating conditions. A detailed study of the proximal femur, which can be assigned to sex, showed in several parameters, for example, the exostosis of the trochanter, the articular border convexity, that males have more of these indicators of habitual locomotion and job-related stress markers, suggesting a sexual division of labor. The data on muscle markers support a range of activities that were predicted by the local inhabitants, that were practiced by the local inhabitants, who likely carried out activities on boats as well as carrying heavy loads, all of which could affect the morphology of the proximal femur. But the local population also participated in farming. Janet Cope, a physical therapist, completed a PhD dissertation looking at the bones of the elbow and wrist for the Tell Abraq adults, and she found very high frequency of specific stress markers likely related to maritime activities. As Thea Mollison found for the farmers in Abu Huraira, we have found such changes as well in the toes, the knees, the shoulders, consistent with the use of grinding querns. 2 new studies looking at the effects of carrying heavy loads on the vertebral column are underway. The making and transport of mud bricks would have been a major part of building and maintenance of the fortress. Finally, 2 new studies on the upper arm and the knees related to habitual kneeling and squatting, following again the work of Thea Mollison, show that squatting was likely a habitual activity of both sexes. Finally, the unusual burial mentioned that is the only primary articulated interment in the whole of the tomb was possibly the last person put in the tomb prior to its not being used, and she has an intriguing pathology. This slide shows a series of things that we found on her skeleton, suggesting that at the time of death, she was a female, approximately 16 to 18 years old, and she had either polio, late onset polio, or cerebral palsy. It's difficult to do differential diagnosis because both of these neuromuscular patterns show up pretty similarly on the bones, which you can see are very thin and fragile, and she's got inflammation around the joints. So in summary, we see over a 100-year period use of this tomb. We have 402 individuals minimally placed into the tomb. They're primarily disturbed, so the disturbance is not a natural effect, it's a cultural effect of individuals placing burials and moving bones to the back, possibly piling them up to create more space for additional burials. We think this is a mostly community-used tomb, in part because there are so many preterm infants from miscarriages or spontaneous abortions, so many newborns, so many infants between the ages of new birth and 2. We've got adult males and females of all ages and sexes. We have teenagers. So clearly this was a tomb that was used for everyone who died at the site during that 100-year period. The presence of 2 foreign or non-local individuals is interesting and may suggest that this site was one of a lot of trade and interaction between far-flung places. Finally, we show a fair amount of disuse and disability on the bones of the adults from a lot of hard occupationally work-related stresses. Infection was moderate as far as we can tell compared to other Near Eastern populations where these data have been reported, and may have simply been due to communicable diseases such as staph and strep. Thank you.